Hey guys, what's going on? Just gonna be doing an update video from my previous one, which I did on Milsim West, Balkar Ridge, which is, as some of you know, if you've seen that video, I will be heading to Milsim West Balkar Ridge, which is in Gore, Virginia, from May 12th to the 14th, and it is currently May 21st, so a week after the event officially ended on Sunday. And that was around 11 or 12 o'clock. And I'm just going to be going over my experience of what happened there. And for some of you who thought I was going to drop out, I didn't, and I'll go over my experience throughout the entire 40-hour event. But just to get things out of the way, I didn't drop out for all of the people who thought I would, and I just want to give a quick one of those to the people who thought I would. Just to get that out of the way. Anyway, so first of all, I arrived at around 3 o'clock. The check-in time was between 2 to 6 p.m., if I recall correctly. And I arrived around 3 o'clock, and I got all my stuff together. And I didn't quite meet with my squad yet. I was part of 5th Platoon, 2nd Squad, Team B, Team 2, Team Bravo, whatever you want to call it. And so we arrived at the NATO parking site, which was probably maybe 300 feet or 100 yards from the meeting area. I then walked over there with all my stuff, and then I laid it out for inspection. And then I soon met, I think this was like maybe quarter or 20 after 3 o'clock, I met with my squad, which was Wyatt, Tice, and Ryan. I don't quite remember Ryan's last name, but their names were Wyatt Taylor and Tice Pat. And Wyatt was my squad leader. Excuse me. Ryan, he was, he was probably could be considered a medium machine gunner. He carried a 240 Bravo the entire time. And then Tice was one of the other squad members, and then I was also one of the squad members. They all came from Ohio, and we all met together and we got acquainted. And then we went over some of the check-in processes. How it worked is, in the tax op, which I'll link below, the tax op is everything that you need to know if you're going to participate in Milsim West, such as what gear you need to bring, what uniform, so on and so forth, all the rules, medic rules, search rules in case like you search a dead, I should say, individual in the game, so on and so forth. I'm not going to get into that. I'll link it below. But the way we did was basically we would raise up all the red carded items or red highlighted items listed in the tax op, such as our Milsim West tourniquets, a notepad and pencil, Sharpie or pen, whatever, to write stuff down in, iPro, uniform, top and bottoms, plus belt, shoes, socks, t-shirt, so on and so forth, all the regular uniform items, as well as a sleeping bag, at least 2 pairs of socks, 2 trash bags, and enough food and water in order to sustain you the entire event. And also a wristwatch to keep track of the time. And that's about it, basically. 9 items total. I think, yeah, somewhere around there. If I'm wrong, you can go ahead and read the tax op and find out yourself. So, all of our gear was accounted for. That was absolutely essential to bring. If we did not have that, we couldn't play, unfortunately. Then we all met together. We put our stuff, depending on what squad we were in, we gathered around, put all of our stuff in one area, and then we lined up to get our guns chronoed, which is what we did. And then soon after, we all got our ammo issued to us, as well as our tourniquets if we need it, and our maps, as well as our patches, which I don't have it right now with me, but it was my TF Hammer patch, and actually I could probably grab that. Nah, probably not. It's downstairs at the moment. But anyway, so Then we were all just sitting around, chatting, conversing. I made a couple phone calls, basically, took a few pictures, phone calls just to let my family know how I'm doing, how the trip was, so on and so forth, just so that they don't have to worry about me. You guys would probably do the same thing. Anyway, and then at around 6 o'clock, we had that was pretty much the deadline for check-in, basically. And then we all stood around a little bit more, if I recall correctly, and then probably closer to 7 or 8, maybe 7, we had a safety briefing in which one of the members, or I forget his name, I think his name was Brian, but I'm not quite sure. He was one of the cadre members. He gave a quick safety briefing, such as the most common injury that we may experience tonight is an exposure injury, whether we're too wet, we're too cold, what to do if we're going to basically want to leave early, which is inform the cadre ahead of time so that they're not searching for you in the middle of the night, stuff like that. And they also told us that yeah, and that they don't really have a very sophisticated way of actually getting us out of there if we suffer a exposure type injury or any type of injury um, and then they then gave us later after that they gave us a briefing as to what our mission is, and our objective or mission, whatever you want to call it, would be to occupy an area that the Russians currently occupy, to set up a radio repeater site on one of the ridges, and then hold that site for the entirety of the game. And this site would be holding the radio repeater necessary for our fictional armor to move into that area to advance, basically, because they couldn't advance, and so we were sent in first to basically clear out the area of any Russian forces that were in there, or Russian and militia forces, and then the armor, fictional armor, would roll in and then flush out any remaining Russian forces in that area. And so that was it, and then we all rucked up, and then we walked, I'm not quite sure how far we walked. It may have been like somewhere in the range of half a mile. I don't quite know exactly. If anyone knows, leave a comment down below. And then it got dark around 9 o'clock, and we were all told to drop our packs at one point to go on a patrol, and that's exactly what I did. And that's when things started to get a little bit messed up. I accidentally split away from the guys that I was supposed to be with by accident, mostly because I couldn't see, unfortunately. The guys were using nods, which I did not have, and I was just basically, the only thing that I could really see was probably a couple trees in front of us. But in terms of seeing what was on the ground, forget it. It was definitely too dark for that. And I think a majority of the guys were using Gen 1 nods, which are not as good as the Gen 2 or Gen 3s. Most, if you're willing to invest in the money, most guys would get Gen 3s because they have a much higher clarity, and they also have a much wider field of view. If the guys were running Gen 1 nods, they would typically have an IR light in order to illuminate the area much better, but if there's any Russian forces using those, using nods as well, one guy described it as the IR light as being almost a beacon, so that the Russians would easily catch on to that, basically. So they tried to stay off those as much as possible. Eventually, I made it with some guys over at 1st Platoon, or actually no, 2nd Platoon, who were part of the forces meant to try and actually take the ridge. 1st Platoon would mostly do that, and they were some of the guys from one of the main forces, or assaulting forces, meant to take the actual ridge or repeater site. Eventually, I made it back with my squad, and then we moved, we put our rucks back on, and then we moved up further, and then we made it to an area where we would be camping out for the night. And at this point, it's after 10 o'clock, and we were told to just make a shelter just to keep all the rain off of us, and that's exactly what me and Ryan did, our support gunner, basically. And we just basically kind of just put together some makeshift shelter. I ran some paracord in between 2 trees, and then I placed my tarp over. He used his tarp to keep us off the wet ground, which was also covered in rocks. Half the area was filled with large rocks or stones, by the way, which made it difficult to try and find a comfortable place to sleep in. Not to mention the fact that we're on a large, sort of like somewhat elevated piece of ground, so any water that's running down in there would immediately just collect in on the bottom of our tarp that was on the ground. So that was another problem with it. And then plus his side, we then laid my tarp over to where it's basically sort of a roof shape, and then we secured the corners with paracord. And his side was a little lower than mine, so he stayed much drier than I did during the night. And then once we got something, we just went underneath there just to try and stay dry from the rain. Ryan proceeded to cook himself up an MRE. I proceeded to change into appropriate clothing for the night, and then we were told that at this point it was around 11 o'clock at night, maybe even close, maybe half past 11, and we were told to try and take 2 to 3 hour watches just to make sure that no enemy forces would attack us while we were sleeping. So I volunteered to take the first watch. And, well, he got some sleep, and it was miserable, I'll say that. I actually really didn't like it, I'll say that, and closer to early in the morning, like maybe 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I somewhat considered quitting, because at that point it just rained since about 3 o'clock. I was soaking wet, especially my feet. My feet were especially wet after the patrolling, the short amount of patrolling that we did. I unfortunately didn't pack appropriate boots. I thought my boots would do the job the entire game, but no, they were wet. So were my feet and my socks. And each time I tried to change my socks, they just got wet as well. And it was too cold for them to dry off, like say air dry them, and then. I was wearing, I don't think I was wearing enough layers as well, which would explain why it was cold. I was wearing a t-shirt underneath underneath a fleece polypro top, and then over top of that I had a polyester wind and waterproof jacket. In addition to me wearing a wool beanie. And not only that, but also water was collecting on top of my rucksack. Because I had placed my poncho over top of it just to protect it in case, like say, because it was partially open, I was worried about all the contents getting wet, which thankfully they didn't at that point. And then around, I think maybe 1 or 2 o'clock, I tried to get some sleep, and every like half an hour to like maybe 45 minutes, even an hour, maybe, I would just wake up. At one point, my leg cramped up a bit. And the only way I could feel comfortable was basically getting on all fours, quite literally, and just breathing calmly. At one point, I probably almost vomited, unfortunately. And I was thinking to myself that I may have met my limit. I may consider just quitting. I really didn't want to. Thankfully, I didn't, and we all have our limits. If it's reached at one point, then there's no shame in really dropping out. And in fact, some of our guys from 5th Platoon, and in general, did in fact drop because they were either too cold. Some of them probably even got sick. One guy was complaining of chest pains because of how cold he was. He was almost shaking uncontrollably. My legs were also wet, so were my pants and underwear because of how our tarp was constructed. And it was definitely not a very pleasant experience. My squad leader, Wyatt Taylor, he didn't really set up a shelter. And this was by his own choice. I'm not nitpicking him for his decision making, but he basically set up his tarp over top of them and just covered his face and body while he and another player slept on the ground. So that was his choice. That's fine, but it definitely probably wasn't the most comfortable. Everyone was just sort of just not very happy by the next morning, and this was about 6 in the morning. Me and Ryan actually learned a neat trick, kind of, which is that you can use an MRE heater bag to use as a improvised hand warmer, which was also another thing that I didn't bring. which I'm definitely going to bring if I participate in another wet weather event for Milsim West. I do plan to attend another Milsim West sometime in the future. The next event is going to be taking place. It's called the Caspian event. I'm not quite sure, but I'll leave a link in the description below. Their next event is going to be taking place in Georgia in October. And I don't think I'll be participating in that because it's going to be very difficult to try and travel down there. I'm not going to drive because it's going to take too long and plus be pretty expensive. And plus flying is probably just as expensive. And it's just too far in general. I'll most likely go to another Milsim West event that is located on the East Coast, if they do plan to do more of them, which I'm hoping they will. Anyway, so by about, I think, 7 or 8 a.m., Wyatt and Ryan proceeded to, because they had lost Tice. I wouldn't say they lost him, but Tice got mixed up with some of the guys up on the actual radio repeater site, and so they decided to go ahead and just go find him and bring him back to the campsite, because apparently he was in pretty bad shape. Apparently, according to him, I think he said he was almost pre-hypothermic, and he was pretty cold and wet, and according to Wyatt, I think, and Ryan, that if he felt like he wasn't up to it or up for it, that would be the straw that would break the camel's back, and that would have them consider leaving. Unfortunately, thankfully they didn't. Tice, anyway, Ryan and Wyatt proceeded to head up the hill, and I thought I'd join them, and they the route. That was their choice. That's fine. I was willing to do it as much as I can, but I unfortunately couldn't really make it up. It was a steep hill. It was probably like maybe, I don't know how steep it was. It was probably maybe at least 45 degrees. And I honestly, I didn't feel like I could make it, so I didn't make it the full way with them, unfortunately, and so I just simply went back to the camp. Unfortunately, I will admit that I was not able to do as much as they could. Anyway, and then I just basically went back to the camp just to try and warm up, basically converse with a few of the guys over there, trying to keep my feet dry, and along with my socks. And that was the other thing that would have made me consider quitting, unfortunately. My feet were just, they looked like prunes because of how wet and probably all the chafing that occurred through walking for relatively long periods of time. Or long distances. We didn't walk too far, I'll say that, but because of my feet, because they were wet, that was another reason. My feet were a bit painful, and plus they did not look very pleasant as well. I thought, I was worried that I was going to suffer a foot type injury, a wet weather injury, basically, which thankfully did not occur. And then probably maybe around mid-morning, mid-afternoon, maybe after 10 o'clock, Tice came back. He was a little bit better as a result, and then we went out on a patrol. We just basically search out for any Russian forces in the area, and then we did in fact make contact with some of the Russian guys over on a steeper part, probably near near the site of the radio repeater. I don't quite know, and we did. We took out a few of the Russian guys at one point, but then towards us it was a large rock area, and that's where they probably set up a machine gun. And then we took out those guys, and then towards our left, at the bottom of the steep, or the incline, we all of a sudden just started seeing Russian guys just run up there and start shooting us, and as a result, I got hit, and as Wyatt was tourniqueting me, putting my tourniquet on my arm, which I made the mistake of wearing my fleece top over top of my combat shirt and my jacket. He had a difficult time, so that was a fuck up on my own part for not placing my tourniquet in appropriate spots. So I'll admit that right there, and as a result, he got hit. So my idiocy resulted in him getting hit as well. And then the Russian guys stormed up. They took out the remaining guys over there, unfortunately. And then they searched us for if we had any valuable things on them, which we didn't because we were told not to write anything down, any valuable information, or carry any sensitive information such as maps that were too well detailed, things like that. Yeah. So we waited 5 minutes, which was our bleed out time, and then we went back to our camp. And then I went to try and air out my feet, and one of the guys saw it, and he immediately said that you have immersion foot. Go try and just sit down, let your feet air out, let your socks dry, basically let your boots air out, and that's exactly what I did. And then at one point, one of the guys, I think he was part of one of the 5th Platoon commanders, a guy named Brian, apparently he was from GMR. He came to me when I was sitting next to a small fire, which went out, unfortunately. And he told me to get my stuff as we were experiencing contact at part somewhere near our actual campsite. I'll try and describe this for you, but we had the main road, which is what we took to get here. So that was that, and then where I was sitting. It would have been on my left, and we were experiencing contact from where my front would be, basically. And immediately, I just put on my shoes and grabbed my gun, my rifle, and we just started engaging Russian enemy soldiers in that area, which we thankfully took out. And then, yeah, I will admit that the entire time I was complaining about my feet and how painful they were. Go ahead, post whatever comments, but everyone complains, let's face it. I like to call it venting, basically. So, anyway, thankfully the nice guys over at 1st Platoon had a nice large fire going, and so I went over there and managed to dry out my boots and my feet, which felt much nicer, and then I changed it to a nice dry set of socks. Meanwhile, while that was going on, Wyatt and Ryan, as well as Tice, proceeded to expand upon me and Ryan's makeshift shelter that we built at 10 o'clock on Friday night. And Wyatt and Tice placed their tarps, or not their tarps, their ponchos to act as roofs, and then they secured those to trees with paracord. We then laid all of our gear underneath our shelter, and then I placed my poncho in front of where I had been staying the entire night. And then I placed all my gear there. And then we also hanged some of our gear on trees. Wyatt's also, at one point, he made himself a duct tape clothesline, which was pretty hilarious, just to dry out some of his clothing. And we were just relaxing at that point. This was probably like maybe, I don't quite remember. It might have been around 2, 3, 4 o'clock. I'm not quite sure. And then, at one point, me and Ryan started to basically patrol around the campsite in case of any Russian forces who may be probing that area, or just basically patrolling the area, while Tice and Wyatt went on another, I think, a bit of recon or another patrol, and me and Ryan just basically stuck around there, just patrolling the area. We sort of tried to follow a star formation, in which we would go from one end, then go back to the other, then go to another. We go a certain distance, basically just patrolling for any Russian forces that may be near there, Russian probes, whatever you want to call it. And then around 5, 6 o'clock, we were all told that we should probably prepare for a possible assault from the Russians over by a ridge area that was near our campsite, because if you were to go probably maybe 20 or 30 yards to the left or even towards the front, there was a drop-off, a slight drop-off or a slight incline into the ridge, into where we were sleeping, and we thought that the commanders thought that we may experience a Russian contact on that area, like if they were to just basically storm that area with troops. So we all positioned ourselves in sort of a J formation. I was somewhere in the loop of the J, and then we all basically just prepared for a possible engagement. Thankfully, that didn't really happen, and so that was good. And then for the rest of the night, we all just started preparing ourselves for the final morning and afternoon. And then around 9 and 10 o'clock, we were told by one of our commanders that we should prepare. According to him, NATO normally does a small or a large full-scale attack on the Russians in the morning, but we were told to basically send out a small patrol and then hopefully make contact with the Russian forces that were in that area, and then intentionally fall back to our base camp or to our campsite, and then basically bring them into a killing zone in which we would all engage on them and hopefully take them all out. Basically trick them, basically bait them, whatever you want to call it. And so, yeah, after that, we all started to just basically prepare. They told us we were going to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and have an hour to get all of our stuff ready for said patrol, and we would move out at about 6. And then so around 10 o'clock, we all started to basically just fall asleep. Some of us stayed up in order to basically keep watch or keep guard. And then around 11 or 12 o'clock, we experienced some actual contact from the first platoon. Experienced some contact over by the road of where we were stationed near. And as soon as we all heard that, we just woke up. We heard blank fire here from the Russian side, or as well as possibly from our side, and then we all just prepared. I grabbed my gun. I was in my sleeping bag. I immediately just leapt out of that, thinking that we may experience contact coming towards us. Thankfully, that didn't happen. It died down soon afterwards, and then it was around 5 or 6 o'clock, and we all woke up, started just basically grab something to eat. And then it was around 7 when we actually pulled out for the patrol, 7 or 8. And then we did make contact with the Russian forces, in which our small patrol element just basically got wiped out, unfortunately. And it happens, unfortunately. And then we all bled out, some of us, and then we just started running back to our actual base camp just to try and finish off the Russians. Like I said, I bled out, and then that happened to me again, probably maybe a few minutes afterwards, unfortunately, along with a couple other my guys that were with me in my squad or even just near me in general. And then once me and Tice were there, he was next to me, probably a couple feet away from me. We bled out. It'd been 5 minutes at that point, and then we just went over by some of the NATO cadre or commanders. Over by the Humvee was on the road that we took to get there, and then we just sat there just to let the final fight to occur. And then a couple minutes later, they called a ceasefire, ending the fight. And or the entire event in general. We all unloaded our guns, and then we basically just conversed with the Russians afterwards, and just jaw-jacked, as it's called in the military. And then we met up with our cadre or commanders, and they told us we did a very good job in general, not only in the fact that we held the repeater site the entire time, the forces up there that at least, and also just a good job in general, especially for the guys who were there for the first time, according to him. and I'll probably post in some footage. I plan to do a couple of these videos. This first one will be just my experience, me talking, as well as a video of of what I managed to capture during the actual event, and then a loadout video of all the gear that I brought with me. Forgot to mention that, sorry. And then we then had our after-action briefing, in which we got any comments or suggestions from both the Russian and NATO forces, as well as the militia forces. And those were all taken under advisement by Josh, one of the cadre members. And then we all put our rucks back on, and then we walked over to either the staging area or NATO parking. And then I got picked up by my brother, and then we went back home to Pennsylvania. So that's pretty much it. That's what happened. That was my last weekend in just a short, well, not really short, but just a brief summary. I'm sorry if this video was very lengthy, but that's just what happened the entire time. And overall, I had a very good time. If Milsim West does come to the East Coast again, I definitely will consider signing up. And I will admit that some of you kind of, yes, I did at one point or a couple points consider dropping out early, like some of my other guys, unfortunately, who did miss out on a pretty good Milsim West experience, or Milsim experience, or Milsim game, whatever you want to call it. But I didn't. I just soldiered on, as they say. I was just worried that something was going to happen to my feet. Thankfully, my feet are still fine. Or I thought I was going to get ill, basically. So, yeah, I made the entire 40 hours. It was very good overall. I liked it. I'm sure some of you who may be watching this video were there as well. You probably had a blast too. Anyway, that's pretty much it. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you for sticking around for this very long and lengthy video. But I'll see you guys next time. Check out my channel for my other videos. Rate, comment, subscribe, and share. And thank you once and all for watching the video. See you guys next time.